Yeah, and so for the purposes of trying to keep things separate, because we are then going to combine them again later, but sort of, so these terms are not set in stone. So I've laid out what I'm going to refer to as player progression versus subjective progression versus character progression. All three of these things could in some way be thought of as just character progression in its classic sense, but I want to sort of disentangle these because I think they are distinct facets. So we're talking about the same gem, but we're looking at it from different perspectives. And so, okay, player progression, the first one. What do I mean by this? So this is sort of the what Lauren had just said. This is like sort of the assembly of like characteristics and like abilities that you like have and how they transform over time. And so like, the classic example of this would be sort of, in an RPG, when you level up, you gain enough experience to level up, you get a new ability, and with that new ability, you can engage in new forms of gameplay. That is a transformation because prior to having that ability, you couldn't necessarily do those sorts of things and engage in those forms of gameplay. Before you get the grappling hook, you can't grapple onto things onto the side of buildings. But after you get the grappling hook, you can chuck it up into the air and you can climb up, the side of a building onto the roof very efficiently, or maybe not so efficiently. So that's what we're going to call player progression. Sort of like as you play over time, your player character changes in terms of their capabilities and characteristics. Subjective progression, which is this concept that we introduced in, I wish I would have had this for the previous recording because the episode number is right there.
I know. That's totally
Episode
fine.
90 of the podcast. And so this is a little fuzzy thing because this is sort of the transformation of what you, the player, experience and feel, typically in emotional terms, but not exclusively in emotional terms, as you progress through the game. And so like, in our example from The Last of Us, like how you feel about being Joel is very different at sort of the beginning of the game from how you feel about, that moment that Lauren highlighted, which is the bus depot. Like how you feel about playing as Joel in that moment, like has a very different kind of subjective experience to it than playing as Joel, say at the very beginning of the game, when you're like, well, not playing as Joel at the beginning of the game, but just after the beginning of the game, when you first encounter Ellie, and you're still with Tess, and you go kill that guy for Tess for reasons that are not really explained. So that's subjective progression, this sort of transformation of like the player's experiences over time as you play. Character, what we're going to call character progression, and the thing that we really kind of want to focus on here is is analogous to that subjective progression, but is like the subjective progression of the in-game character. And so this is, as Lauren said, what we typically think of in terms of a novel or a film as the character arc. But it's a little different in terms of games, and so like laying that out. So just to recap: player progression, transformation of abilities and characteristics over time; subjective progression, the transformation of your personal experiences as you play; character progression, the transformation of the experiences of the character who is your avatar in game. Does that make sense, Lauren?
Oh, no, of course it makes sense. I think for me, like for the purposes of this, what's really, really important, right, is that the player progression is something that enables you, right, to usually fight more
Yeah.
challenges, right, that then change your subjective progression of your
Yeah, they're all
experience.
entangled.
And they're all entangled,
Yeah.
right? And then I think that what's interesting is because I kind of want to really build up here into this like level of empathy, right?
Yeah.
Is that if player progression, right, gives you kind of an objective, right, account of your actions, kind of on a skill
Yeah.
tree, right? The more skills you
Yeah, you
get,
can
the
code
better
it. You can
enemies that
literally
you
code it.
can,
Yeah.
yeah, to codify
Yeah.
this, right? You get subjective progression is now you can take on more bosses, right? The big bads. But then also, right, is your subjective progression then relates to, right, your character's kind of progression throughout that
Yep.
story, right? How actually now, right, that you're at the end of the game as Miles Morales, your subjective progression and Miles' progression can diverge, where
Yeah.
he's finally taking on his spoiler best friend, who is now actually the villain, who wasn't really the villain, whatever.
Question.
Is
Big, big,
now
big question
underscored
mark.
by the fact that you, as the player, never unlocked the perfect dodge ability,
This is
So you don't
you
have
always bring it back
access
to the fact that
to
you
that.
never unlocked Perfect Dodge.
Because I don't think you understand that that was such a fundamental part of the player
Yes, yes,
progression
it is.
that it was supposed to literally be the win mechanic of the character's progression at the end of the
Yep.
game that changed my subjective progression
Yes.
of how I experienced that level
But
instead.
because players
And
refuse
so,
to do what designers tell them to do.
and as the designer, I refused to do what the other designers of Insomniac told me to do. And I should have listened. That being said, what I'm trying to say here, right, is well, they're all three parallel tracks,
Yeah.
right? Like I've generated some empathy,
Yeah.
right, around for myself, right? But also the developers. So while it's meta
Yeah.
empathy, it's empathy maybe outside the game.
Yeah.
I think what's really important is you can kind of see in that moment, like the best, truest example of how, because you didn't unlock a skill, right?
Yeah.
I think a more complex and probably more subjective would probably be doing something like a Bloodborne or like an Elden Ring, where the weapons you
Yeah.
create and the multiples experiences, right, that you create are more intertwined. But I think that's too messy. Then somehow you're able to complete this game without literally getting the win mechanic for the freaking final fight.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's not a bug. It is intentional because it's an open world sandbox environmental
Yeah.
design. It is intentional. However, you
Wow.
developers,
Lauren has got the
okay?
finger wag going.
I did do the
You.
finger rag. You, okay? I was about to call out his name, but that's I don't even think he actually worked on that level. That's
Yeah.
fine. It's because I know I love the Insomniac developers. I love them so
Yeah.
much. So if any future Insomniac developers, subscribe to this podcast on Patreon, and you hear this, you guys do great work. Moving on. But yeah, let's really dig into that empathy, Nicholas,
Yeah.
because why do we want to talk about empathy as it relates to this, right, progression?
Well, it relates back to the sort of the point that we ended on at the in the previous episode, which is that a way to think about, like, so if you're a designer, like, you may get, feedback from players, beta testers, or you may have some research based on other related games and the way in which players have reacted to those. All of those things might help you understand, like, how things have played after the fact. But when you're in sort of like the design phase, it's like, okay, well, how do I think about how to construct my game so as to sort of elicit particular emotional and or just like personal reactions to the things that I'm going to do. And so then you have to think about the way in which what we're calling character progression maps onto, or in some cases fails to map onto, because you can do this sort of in an ironic way as well, fails to map onto the player's sort of subjective experience as they're going along. And then having that always in the back of your mind, it can help you sort of like clarify, okay, I need to be doing this, not this, or like, I don't necessarily need, like, I need these features, I don't necessarily need these features, because these features up here are the ones that I need in order to get the response from the player that I'm looking for. And yeah, so, and just to add slightly to that also, I wanted to note that, like, the reason why we're thinking this specifically in terms of progression also relates to something that we highlighted in terms of what The Last of Us was doing very well, which is that their level designers were thinking very conscientiously about sort of the series of encounters and how the series of encounters all sort of like work together to create this kind of, as we said, subjective condition for the player. And then that's why it's a progression. That's why you have to think about sort of like the transformation over time. How are things changing as this new stuff gets introduced as the player goes along?
And I think that for me, what I'm really excited by when I am developing levels or experiences, just like in general, is I am coming at it from of that narrative underpinning.
Yeah.
So it is more related to the subjective experience. So I think what's really interesting for me is when I look at empathy, we're looking at how do we design empathy in video games, or just saying how do you elicit empathy and say if I was to write a novel or if I was writing a comic book, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when we look at comic book design or we look at empathy in terms of storytelling, we go into this kind of cycle of, well, it's about the
Yeah.
character and how relatable is the character to your user or your player. How, if they're relatable, then what does their dialogue sound like? Like, does that make sense? And it gets into this cycle of true just characterization,
Yeah.
right, of a certain type, and it doesn't actually get further into the meat of what is the player actually doing with that character,
Exactly, yeah.
right? And how is the world kind of reacting to that character? And something that you mentioned here in like the show notes was also about not just about how the characters are fixed, right? Because when I'm reading a book, the character is fixed,
Yep.
right? The character's not changing.
Yeah.
I think what's really
Well,
important to
no, it's not
know
that the character's
is
not
that
changing, it's that it's
it's
predetermined.
that well,
It
it's predetermined,
Yeah.
but it's also predetermined. Technically, Joel's predetermined, right? And here's
Yeah.
what we talked about in The Last of Us, and we kind of hinted at was that Joel goes through his own character art, and we can see Joel changing throughout the story and throughout our experiences. The issue is that in games, right, unlike in a book, I am reading, right? Or I think The Witcher is actually a great example because The Witcher show versus The Witcher
Yeah.
game, they are very different, but in both they have a consistent like Geralt,
Yeah.
okay? He never changes. It's not that he doesn't change, he does. It's
Yeah.
just he is a consistent character. And I love talking about this in comparison to Joel actually, because Geralt, when you play The Witcher 3, you have dialogue choice in that game and you can ask things of other people. But there are moments where you will say things sarcastically that you, as the player, actually are curious about. And the world responds to you with, well, I didn't think a Witcher would be interested in that.
Yeah.
And then Geralt's like, well, humor me. Because he's like,
Yeah.
I'm not actually interested. Or he's like, hey, you never, like, he actually fights back against the world,
Yeah.
right? In a non right in this dialogue way,
Yeah.
and that's so crucial and so important because what I'm getting at here is that the player feels like they have agency over the character even when they don't. And so when
Yeah.
I'm reading a book, I don't think that, right? Harry, Ron, and Hermione like going through the Chamber of Secrets or whatever. Like I don't think I'm them. I am reading about them. I'm not putting myself in their shoes.
Yeah.
Right. And even if I was reading a first person book like The Hunger Games, like I am not Katniss Everdeen. Like I'm just reading her thoughts. I'm reading her diary almost.
Yeah.
Right. But when you're playing a game, I am responsible for Joel making it to the other side of the dumpster and for getting it through the horde of infected and for not making a noise and for not getting Ellie killed. Like I am responsible for that.
Yeah.
So even though I don't have agency over technically what Joel decides to do in the story, I do have agency over Joel's actions in the gameplay.
Precisely. Yeah.
And I think that's the connection, right, between the character and the player and the subjective progression that is garnering, I think, some empathy
Well,
from me.
also, if you take that same logic of sort of like control over actions to the nth degree, it can also explain why you can why the sort of the whole logic of identifying with a character breaks down. Because the thing is, when you're reading a novel, the character, like literally the character has been predetermined in the sense that like everything about them has already been written, it's already been printed, it's just going to be realized as you read through. Whereas the thing is, like with games, you can have player characters, you can have avatars that are really kind of just a shell. Like they really don't have much in terms of like personality, personal history, backstory, whatever you want to call it, going on. But they are extremely fleshed out in terms of what you can do through them in the game. And so, okay, just off the top, so this is in the show notes. It's not off the top of my head. So, like in Bioshock, the character that you play as like has a personal history and it's revealed over the course of the game, but in many ways it's kind of irrelevant as you play, because what is more important about that character is sort of the system of abilities and sort of like the way in which the encounters are designed around them, and how that whole thing like structures what you can actually do. That is really well fleshed out. So like even if you don't necessarily know all that much about sort of like the personality or the background of this character that you inhabit, you can still empathize with them because you are in sort of those moments and those experiences that are defining who that character is in terms of the game. Whereas with other media, typically speaking, you have to sort of observe those things rather than sort of like work through them in the way that a game allows you to work through them. And so there's that interesting gap there where games actually reveal that it doesn't have to be about identifying with the character at all. Like you can actually elicit empathy in these other crucially important ways.